action. All right, thanks for coming again. And anybody who's tuning in on Facebook, thanks for tuning in. Tonight we're going to do the Divinely Designed series, and this one again is the Above, Down, Inside, Out. I designed this presentation series just to help people better appreciate this miraculous machine that we're walking around in here, the body, and how it works and how, you know, it stays healthy and how it becomes unhealthy and how we get that back and all those things. I thought people need to know this information to get the most out of their care for sure, but also just helps them in life in general. So Divinely Designed, we're always going to kind of start out from the beginning, and in the beginning, right, you know, let there be light. We talked about when I first did this presentation, we didn't have the technology to show a lot of these things, but now they have actual imagery that can show, like at the moment of conception, there's light, and that's what we see right here. Now there is 3 different phases or stages of light, right? There's the particle phase, there's the wave or function, the wave function, and then there's the field. And when we talk about light in this, you know, in this purpose, we're usually talking about light in a field. So what we actually see is a field that surrounds every living cell that kind of, it contains, like, you can program basically an infinite or near infinite amount of information into a field. That's how we use like these little chips and things, the rare earth minerals that they use actually create a field or have a field that can, you know, program nearly infinite amounts of information into that field of light. So that's what we're witnessing here is the egg, okay, upon conception at fertilization, there's a field generated there, okay, and above, down, inside, out, that logic, again, it's not the cell there that produces that field. That field is from above down, okay? And lux is the term in Latin that we use for that. It's a divine light, okay? The light of life. So when you look at the Latin of John 1:4, in him was life, and that life was the light of men, that divine light is lux, okay? And now we see that field, that information about that cell or really that organism, our body, is programmed into that field. So now that cell knows what to do, and it starts dividing, okay? And 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and so on and so forth. And every one of those cells is identical. They're called stem cells. And at this point, you could take one of those cells and you could program it to become a heart cell or a lung cell or a liver cell or whatever type of cell. And that's basically what's done by that field, okay? Because at a certain point here, as they're dividing, those cells for no, you know, physical reason or chemical reason that we can see, before the invent of this imagery that allowed us to see that field, there was no physical reason that we could see for these cells to ever differentiate. But at this point here, at that gamete stage, it's called, they start to differentiate. And those cells do become a different cell type, okay? And the first thing that the body sets up, the first thing that's programmed for those cells to set up is an organ that can receive and transmit information from that field. And that's the brain and spinal cord. So this is, in embryology, that's called the primitive streak. So it's the first site of the brain and spinal cord. And so the brain and spinal cord develop, and then if you look down that spinal cord, right, the brain's up here, and down the back here, that's the spine. Those nerves branch out, nerve roots they're called. They branch out, and at the end of those nerve roots, there are those generic stem cells, but now the brain is receiving and transmitting that information to those cells to tell them, you're a heart cell, you're a lung cell, you're a liver cell, and so on and so forth. And those cells actually then develop and differentiate at the end of those branches, okay? Getting that information and that nutrient at the end of those branches, just like a tree, the fruit's growing on the end of those branches. So all those different organs then develop and form, and at, I think that was, I wanted to say that was 12 weeks, then the, the body is all formed, that baby is fully developed in there. Now we just got to keep growing, and at this point, that's when those cells actually start something new, okay? They start actually replicating and reproducing, and there's something called pre-programmed cell death, okay? So up until this point, those cells are immortal cells, they call them, immortal cell lines. So they don't die, they just keep on reproducing. They know how to reproduce. They don't know when they're supposed to die yet until this point. Now we have the introduction of what we call a generation, okay? So we've talked a little bit about this before, but the body at this point begins a state of constant change where cells are building up and cells are breaking down at pretty much the same rate, okay? We say that body is at ease when the breakdown and the buildup is the same, okay? So if you could see your body as it really is, you'd never see it the same way twice. Hey, Lewis. Hey, Mary, come on in.
We may be a little late.
No worries. Come on in. Make yourself at home. So we were just talking about how the body starts developing from that single cell, and at this point here, where we're at about 12 weeks, that's where those cells actually start to replace themselves, okay? So up until this point, those cells are immortal cells. They don't die. But at this point in our development, that baby, those cells start to actually replace themselves. So we introduced the idea of a generation, okay? A generation of cells. So here we see that the skeleton actually replaces itself every 90 days. So roughly every 3 months, those old cells in your skeleton will die off and new ones come in to take their place, okay? That's one generation. And a generation of skin cells, that's about a month. A generation of the lining of your stomach, that's about 4 days, okay? And there are some cells that actually slough off, that produce the mucus on the surface of the stomach there every 5 minutes. Liver, that's a 6-week generation, okay? And red blood cells, they're about 90 days, but there's so many of them that they're turning over at such a fast rate that we wear out about 10 trillion red blood cells every second. So the point is, those cells are constantly turning over, okay? Old cells dying off, new cells coming in, and something has to control and tell each of those cells, like I said, it's programmed into that field, how that liver cell is supposed to turn over and what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to do it, okay? So in chiropractic philosophy, we talk about innate intelligence or inborn intelligence. And chiropractic philosophy, the actual chiropractic textbook is called The Expression of Intelligence Through Matter is a Chiropractic Definition of Life. And B.J. Palmer, the guy that helped develop chiropractic, said, the master maker of the human body did not make you and then run off and leave you masterless. So, like we were talking about, that program on how this body is supposed to work is programmed or coded into that field that we saw, even at the single cell level, already surrounds that cell and tells it what to do and maintains it in existence as such, okay? So in chiropractic, we call it an innate intelligence, but the only thing that we can really relate it to would be AI, like artificial intelligence, okay? Because it's a program. It's something that somebody has to sit down and decide, okay, here's the code that I'm going to use to get this body to do this when it's confronted with this stress, okay? It's a very complex algorithm. So the inborn ability of a living thing to adapt forces and matter. So you adapt the force of gravity every day. You adapt the forces of nature out there, radiation and everything else. You adapt that, like the sun's radiation, you adapt it to make vitamin D in your body, okay? There has to be a code written down for how that happens in your body. It's a complex process, okay? There's a program for that, right? So that's basically innate intelligence in a nutshell. It's the intelligence, that program that runs our body and tells our body what to do and when to do it and how to do it, okay? And of course, the forces of innate intelligence, that program, they run from above down, like in the brain, above down, and from inside out. And it happens no other way. And now we have the technology, like I said, to actually see that brain is receiving, okay? The brain doesn't create that light when we think, okay, move your arm. You know, the brain receives that information from the mind, if you want to look at it that way. But the mind isn't contained within the brain, okay? It's a field, like we saw that field surrounding that cell. You can see that field surrounding your body with that same imagery, okay? I should probably get a picture of that for next time. But that's actually the imagery of the brain when we say, okay, move that arm, move that leg. That area lights up, but it's receiving and then transmitting that information. So that's what the brain does, okay? So the nervous system, we're going to argue, is probably the most important system that we have, because without it, we're dead. But something has to receive and transmit that information to the body to tell the heart when to beat and how hard to beat and all those good things, right? You ask the average Joe on the street, what's the most important organ in your body? They'll probably say the heart, because when my heart stops, I'm dead. Well, technically, you're not dead for like another 4 to 10 minutes until your brain stops working, right? Because that brain is receiving and transmitting, telling that heart what to do. So we've got the brain up here completely contained in hard bone, completely encased in the skull. And then we've got the spinal cord, which runs from the brain all the way down to your tail here. And that's completely encased in hard bone, but it's like plate armor, and it's movable. Okay, the nice thing about that plate armor, the spine, is that it is movable. If it was just a solid column of bone, you couldn't bend over and tie your shoes or twist or look over your shoulder at traffic. So the secret to motion in the spine is actually that disc, that pad in between, okay? So that pad allows motion. It allows the absorption of that stress of gravity, but the thickness of that pad is what opens up that hole for those nerves, those nerve roots then, to exit out and carry their message out to the heart and the lungs and the liver and all those different parts of the body and tell them what to do. And remember, if that system there of protection is working the way it's supposed to, all those messages get out where they're supposed to be going, okay? And we would have a state of ease. Like I said, all those cells are breaking down and being built up at the same rate. That's ease. But we do have things from time to time that will cause us to go away from that, where it'll cause a state in the body. We call it dis-ease in chiropractic, but it's basically where things are breaking down more than they're building up. Okay, another D word for that is degeneration. So this whole chart here represents degeneration. That's what happens is things start sliding down that downward spiral. We get symptoms, we get all-out diseases, but it starts with that degenerative process. So if you think about heart disease, okay, if we choke off that nerve in that example going out to the heart, like if we did that at an early stage, in like lab mice, they'll do this sometimes where they'll take that embryo state and they'll sever that nerve that's going out to that group of cells that's going to become the heart, and that heart never develops because we just stop that information from getting there, okay? Now in an adult body, if we choke off using one of those bones that's protecting that nerve, if we twist it and we choke off that nerve going out to the heart, now that heart isn't turning over those cells the way it's supposed to, okay? Sometimes those cells will revert back. If they're getting no information, they'll revert back to that actual generic state where they only know how to grow and how to reproduce, and they don't know when they're supposed to die or turn over. So what do we call a group of cells in the body that just grows, reproduces, and never dies? A tumor, right? So a lot of times that's how a tumor is going to develop, but it's a degenerative process. It's not like instantaneous, we choke off that nerve and that happens. It happens over generations, okay? So those old cells die off, the new ones come in. When that next generation comes in, it's still getting less information than the generation before, okay? So that's how we go down that downward spiral, all right? So the interference with that transmission in the body, it causes that incoordination, and that's what leads us to that disease or that degeneration. In the body, because we have the nervous system there, receiving and transmitting that information, that interference is either directly or indirectly usually due to interference with the nervous system. And chiropractic, we just call that a subluxation, okay? So interference with the transmission in the body is directly or indirectly due to subluxation. So this is that example of a subluxation where we've got that brain sending that, it's receiving and sending information down the spinal cord, out that nerve to the liver or the kidneys, let's say. I think I got an example of the kidney. Okay, so we've got that subluxation choking off that nerve, and that message isn't making it out to that kidney. We know that that's a degenerative process, okay? So is it going to get better with time or worse with time? Degeneration means every generation's getting worse. So day one, we're choking off, let's say, 40% of those messages going out to the body, okay? Or maybe we've got 40%, I think is the example that I use. So 40% of those messages going it out to that kidney. Like 5 years later, because of that degeneration, we're probably down to about 20%. And after 10 years, we're down to 10%. After 15 years, you see where we're going this. Eventually, we hit 0%, okay? There's no messages going out to that body. It's degenerated to the point where now we'll see symptoms actually in that organ of degeneration and decay, okay? So when we choke off that life completely to those cells, that's actually a dead kidney, and it's in somebody's body, okay? We've got to go in there and surgically remove that because a dead kidney in your body is toxic, and that'll kill you. But jump in your little time machine and go back 15 years, okay, there's a lot that can be said here. The importance of knowing that, that probably didn't hurt until it was too late, because those nerves going out to that kidney aren't pain-sensitive nerves, they're functional nerves. 90% of the nerves in our body are actually functional. They're carrying information to or from an organ, telling it what to do, not pain necessarily, okay? So we can have that going on. That degeneration process usually doesn't hurt until, the straw that breaks the camel's back. I see it all the time in people's spine where they have, 30 years of degeneration, and they say, I had no pain until yesterday. I bent over to tie my shoe, and bang, I got a herniated disc. Tying your shoe doesn't cause herniated discs, but there was a degenerative process going on there, okay? Every generation was getting worse, and eventually something has to break down, and that's what we have here. Something eventually breaks down. And when we do get a symptom, how often have we been taught to just cover up that symptom, take something for that symptom? Like one of the big symptoms of a kidney problem is high blood pressure. But we've got a million different pills for high blood pressure. So if we went into the doctor and we didn't have pain and they checked us out and the only thing that they found was this guy's got high blood pressure, they're probably just going to put us on a blood pressure med. Then the underlying cause here, that kidney problem, continues to get worse until it hits that point, okay? So we want to look at that subluxation and take that a little bit more seriously, because the end result is always something that's degenerative, and it's something that really drastically impacts our health a lot of times. So we want to catch those early if we can, and that's what a chiropractor is supposed to do. They're supposed to check people for that subluxation. And how do we check it? We look at, like I said, a functional exam of those nerves to see how they're functioning. And if we know that that person has a kidney problem, and we see that there are nerves that go out to their kidneys that aren't functioning the way they're supposed to, Then we look at that spine, we take an x-ray and we look at that alignment and we see is it lined up? Is it opening that hole for that nerve? And if it's not, if it's choking down that hole on that nerve, again, that's a subluxation. That's what chiropractors are supposed to do, is find those and correct them. Most chiropractors now are just doing physical therapy and, you know, nutrition and other things, but the value in that cannot be overstated, right? So that's what chiropractors are supposed to be doing, and that's why I like to teach people about the body and how it works and the importance of knowing that, okay? So what's the number one cause of subluxation? The birth process. How many of you been through it? Because in a quote-unquote normal birth, okay, there doesn't have to be a slip or a fall or a car accident. Those things do happen, especially in Minnesota. But if you were born, chances are, you know, unless you were born at home in a tub, somebody put their hands on your head or your neck or forceps or whatever, and they pull and they twist to get the shoulders clear of the birth canal. And sometimes they'll use 60 to 90 pounds of pressure on an infant's neck to get the shoulders clear of the birth canal. 60 to 90 pounds. So you wouldn't take an infant and palm them by the head and then hold them like this with just their body weight, right? Because you'd think, oh, that would kill them. It wouldn't kill them, but it would definitely damage them. And that's what, like I said, a lot of us, myself included, had injury at birth, and that's why we check babies. Okay, so we check babies for subluxation because, like, when my oldest was born, I remember the midwife specifically grabbing his head and kind of twisting and pulling to get his shoulder clear. And when he came out, we noticed he couldn't turn his head and nurse from the left. And, you know, it was like, I saw it happen, so I checked him, I adjusted him, boom, everything's clear. If we can catch it like that, it's 100% correctable. You know, you catch something and there hasn't even been one generation of degeneration, it's 100% correctable. So that's why I encourage people to get their kids checked. This is a fiber optic view of the brain stem at the level of the first cervical there. Okay, so that's the most common area injured in the birth process there. The brain's up here, and then here's the spinal cord, or the brain stem, and going down the canal there becomes the spinal cord. And I always like to end on this one with a story of my first chiropractic patient. Was actually a Hmong kid in St. Paul. His name is Duke. And when Duke was 19 years old, he's developmentally delayed. You have to know that about him. He walked a little slower, talked a little slower, but at 19, he's walking down the street in St. Paul, and 4 guys in a car, supposedly this is like gang related, saw Duke walking down the street and noticed he's different, and they jumped out and they started heckling him, and Duke ran down this alley to try and get away. And of course, he ran slower and they caught him. And they started beating him up, and they beat him until he was on the ground, and then they continued beating him until he stopped moving, and then they continued beating him until he stopped breathing. And they picked him up and they threw him in a dumpster, and they left him there for dead. And by some miracle of God, somebody saw this whole chase taking place, and they called 911. And the ambulance got there. Actually, the police got there first, and they found him in this dumpster. And they got him out, and they start doing CPR and first aid. And the ambulance got there not long after, and they stabilized him, which meant that he was breathing, okay? But he was in a coma, and he was in that coma for 4 months. And when he came out of that coma, he was paralyzed, but it wasn't like somebody who had been neck down, waist down in a car accident. It was like somebody who had had a stroke or a brainstem injury, okay? His left side was paralyzed. His right side, which wasn't like a stroke, was just this severe searing, like on fire pain, okay? And he woke up screaming in agony, so they're doping him up, giving him drugs, trying to take down this pain so that they can do tests to try and figure out what's wrong with this kid. And right now, there's just really one healthcare profession that looks for a 1 or 2 millimeter misalignment, that's subluxation. Everybody else, we're looking for something major, gross, we call it, like a big tumor or a bleeder on the brain or a fracture or something of that nature, and they just weren't finding it. So they sent him down to Mayo, and when Mayo ran every test in the book down there and didn't find anything, they sent him home with a prescription for morphine, which is like saying, hey, your kid's going to die. Be comfortable while it happens, okay? But he didn't die. He went on like that for over a year. And his dad said at one point that pain just literally drove him out of his mind to the point where he couldn't handle it. He had gone elsewhere in his mind, and now he's just a shell. Like literally, he's just drooling, his eyes rolled back in his head, and his dad's feeding him through a tube. And at some point along the way, a friend of his dad said, "You should get your kid checked by a chiropractor." And his dad said, "Well, why?" "Because he doesn't have neck pain, back pain, headaches. He's paralyzed and he's a vegetable at this point." And he told him a little bit about that subluxation. He said, maybe they don't check him for a subluxation, on an MRI or whatever. So he said, yeah, okay, I'll get him checked, but I want the cheapest clinic that you can find, which happened to be the student clinic where I worked. And his dad literally carried him in and laid him on the table in front of me, took his shirt off him, and he's got scars all over him from this beating, and he's withered away to like less than 100 pounds. And just skin and bone, eyes rolled back in his head, drooling. And I'm looking at him, never touched a real person yet. We've just adjusted students and, mannequins at this point. And I don't want to touch him because I'm thinking this kid looks like he's going to die. And if I adjust him and he dies tomorrow, who are they going to blame? They're going to blame me, the last guy who touched him. And apparently my supervisor was thinking the same thing because he said, well, he's your patient, John. You do the analysis. Adjust what you find, just don't expect much. That was his sage advice to me. So I did the analysis, and I found interference with that nerves up at the base of the brainstem there, at the base of the skull. And I got a little excited, and we went down, and we laid him down, and we opened his mouth, and we took an x-ray of those top 3 bones, and I found a 3-millimeter misalignment, which isn't huge, but a 3-millimeter misalignment in that first cervical right there at that level of the brainstem. So I'm all excited because I found my first real subluxation. So I only know how to adjust it one way, and I get it. We need a team to do it because I can't do it laying down. I got to do it seated. So I'm holding him up in the chair. His dad and my supervisor are holding him up in the chair, and I put my thumb on that bone and I set it, and it just goes clunk. It just pulls right in. And I'm all excited, and I look at his dad, and his dad goes, like in Hmong, that means, right? And he's like, that's it? That's all you're going to do? I said, well, you can bring him back in a couple days, and I'll check him again if you want to. And I don't speak Hmong, but I'm pretty sure he was cussing. And he picked him up, and he left. And I was freaking out. And we didn't hear anything from him. And then a week from the day that I gave him that adjustment, I'm sitting down in the student lounge reading the funny papers, feet up on the table, and I hear my supervisor come running down the hall, and he busts open the door, and he's like, John! I'm like, what? He goes, Duke's here. I'm like, thank God he didn't die. He goes, you're not going to believe this. You got to see it. So we run down the hall, and we open up the door, and there's Duke sitting upright on this table, looking at me, just a big smile on his face, and his dad's over in the corner just bawling his eyes out. And he said a week from the day that you gave him that first adjustment, he woke up. He literally woke up, and he had no more pain on that right side of his body, and he has function, he has strength again on that paralyzed side of his body. It wasn't 100% because there had been degeneration there. But now that we got that pressure off that brainstem, those messages are making it from the brain out to that side, and regeneration is happening, okay? So eventually he did get to the point where he got darn near, not quite, but darn near equal strength from right to left, because the body is able to regenerate. If we can catch that cause of that degeneration and remove it, the body is able to regenerate. Okay, those old cells will die off, those new ones will come in, they'll be better every time that they turn over. But most people wouldn't even think to bring someone like that to a chiropractor. I think we would probably see what they called it at that point was a chiropractic miracle, right? I believe in miracles, but there's no qualifying it as a chiropractic miracle or a medical miracle. It might have been a miracle, but to me, the miracle is this is how the body was designed. And if it runs the way it was designed to with no interference, it really doesn't need any help, just no interference. And that's what a chiropractor is supposed to do. So that's why we do these presentations. Number one, just to tell you guys how awesome your body is and the potential that you have for healing and regeneration. But also, if people coming in here or watching on Facebook, if you haven't been checked before, just for watching or showing up here, we check people at no charge, and we'll do the full consultation exam, that functional exam, any necessary x-rays, that's on us. And we also do 2 free adjustments because we do a different technique from anybody else in the city. And we want people to actually take it for a test drive and experience the difference there, okay? So you guys have all been checked, and you continue to be checked, which I appreciate. But I'm going to turn it over. Any questions before we take off? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up, and we can all go home and eat supper. And thanks again for coming. And thanks for tuning in.